Welcome to Christmas at the Shores. We are so glad that you're gathering with us, and whether you have been calling this place home now for quite a while or you are brand new, whether you consider yourself a fully devoted follower of Jesus or you're someone who's exploring what it might look like to take your next step in your journey of faith, wherever you might be, we're just so glad you're here. We've been praying for you, we've been preparing for you, and we hope you feel right at home. Would you mind just turning to someone around you or near you, and would you say to them with great passion, Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas. I love this time of the year. It's such a wonderful, wonderful season. And sometimes we say words like Christmas, but we never slow down to consider what they actually mean. And the word Christmas actually comes from two words being merged together. And the first is Christ, which means anointed one or Messiah or used for a king. And then Mass, which is a festival or a celebration. And Christmas is certainly about presents, and it's about laughter. It's about making memories with your family. But most of all, Christmas is slowing down to joyfully celebrate the King, to joyfully celebrate the Messiah, to joyfully celebrate Christ. That's what Christmas is all about. And when we think about Christmas and we think about slowing down to celebrate this moment, we call it the Advent season, this holy anticipation, this sacred moment of recounting the events that led up to the birth of Jesus. And when it comes to the birth of Jesus, Jesus wasn't born in a famous city. There was no campaign from a marketing agency to be able to publicize his birth. Jesus wasn't born in an affluent town with affluent parents and influential parents. That wasn't his story. Jesus was born in a small rural town called Bethlehem. And at the time, there were roughly 200 people who were there. And yet when Jesus was born, hope was released. When Jesus was born, not only was hope released, but God was glorified. When Jesus was born, light was unleashed, and the world has never been the same again. We can never forget that Christmas begins what Easter celebrates. The child in the cradle became the king on the cross, and all God's people said, Amen. I love Christmas. I love everything about Christmas, but I also realize that Christmas for many people, maybe even for you, is Stressmas. It can be complicated. There can be plenty of things that go on, and instead of it being full with joy, it's full with burdens and difficult conversations and hard decisions to make. I remember for my wife and I, a few months before we were married, we had serious conversations of how we would treat the holidays. And I asked her what she thought, and we talked about how do we navigate spending Thanksgiving or Christmas, and what happens whenever we bring children into the picture, and how do you do that in a way that everyone's happy? And ultimately she said, you know what I think we need to do? We need to put together a list of the holidays and where we'll spend them, and then inform our parents and let them know. We need to get out in front of this. And I think if we do this, everyone will be happy. I said, that is a great idea. So why don't you go back and you put together your list, and I'll put together my list, and we'll come back to the table. And so we did, and she shared with me her list. When it came to her family, it was Thanksgiving and Christmas and Easter and Independence Day. That's where we would spend our time. And then for our family, we would get Halloween, we would get Columbus Day, we would get Earth Day, we would get Flags Day. And I looked at that list and I thought maybe that could be tweaked and adjusted just a little bit. And so we have, and everyone's been happy. My parents haven't spoken to me since, but everyone has been happy. We laugh at things like this because the truth is Christmas can be really, really complicated and really stressful, and there can be hard decisions along the way. I mean, how do you adjust, and how do you work through family, and how do you actually have that joy? And even furthermore, how in the middle of the stress, how in the middle of those complicated moments do we experience in fresh ways God's grace? And grace often comes in unexpected places, in unexpected ways, through unexpected people. And in so many ways, the story of Christmas is a story of grace. It's a story of grace in the most unexpected places. If you have a Bible, I want to invite you to make your way over to Matthew chapter 1. Matthew chapter 1, that's the first chapter in the New Testament. And when the Old Testament ends, there's 400 silent years. And then after the Old Testament ends and the New Testament officially begins, a new era has begun. And we don't often read Matthew chapter 1, the gospel according to Matthew. I mean, this is like a flyover chapter. There's names in there that are very hard to pronounce. And we ask ourselves, what does that have to do with my life right here, right now? It seems so irrelevant and we tend to skip over it. But what I would say is to skip over Matthew chapter 1 is to skip over a core experience of God's grace. Grace that is found in the most unexpected place, through the most unexpected people, in the most unexpected way. And so perhaps as we read through some portions of Matthew chapter 1, this Christmas season, you would experience in new and fresh ways an encounter of God's grace. Will you look with me in Matthew chapter 1? We'll read a few portions together. This is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Perez the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Solomon, and Solomon the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth, and Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of King David. We keep reading on. After the exile to Babylon, the father of Shealtiel became the father of Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel was the father of Abiahud. Abiahud, the father of Eliakim. Eliakim, the father of Azor. Azor, the father of Zadok. Zadok, the father of Achim. Achim, the father of Elihud. Elihud, the father of Eleazar. Eleazar, the father of Matan. Matan, the father of Jacob. And Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary. And Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. The genealogy of Jesus. Now, how many of you, as I was reading through that with you, just felt the Holy Spirit move? I didn't hear many amens in the room. I doubt many of you will leave today and say, this is a chapter I want to memorize and I want to internalize because it is so, so good. And yet there is so much here that I think we miss. It is a genealogy, and in our culture, in our time, in our context, a lot of people have curiosities around their genealogy. There have been companies that have been created in recent years, companies like Ancestry.com or 23andMe. In fact, you may have already received a Christmas present in years past from one of those companies. Or maybe this year you're planning on giving that as a present to someone else. It's a serious area of curiosity for people nowadays. The best that I can tell through research, it seems like that on average, there are 15 million people per month that do searches around ancestry, around genealogy, because there's so much there that we are curious about. We want to learn about stories. And along the way, when we do, we discover some family secrets. We discover people who lived in unique circumstances and have a unique story. And you know what? The same is actually true when we enter into the ancestry of Jesus. If we look closely, we're able to detect some family secrets, some unique people that you might not expect to be included in a genealogy about the Messiah. And here's what they do. They teach us not only about Jesus' family, but even more, they teach us something about God and how God relates to us. Again, I know when you read a portion of genealogy, you may not at first be moved, but I'm telling you, there is so much there to uncover when it comes to the unexpected grace of God. Now, Matthew serves in many ways like Jesus' PR director, and he has put together the genealogy of Jesus. And at first glance, you might expect it's very normal because he's tracing Jesus' heritage back to King David. and this journey of the long-awaited royal Messiah. But that's at first glance. At a deeper glance, you might think that Matthew is absolutely sabotaging the reputation of Jesus. And the reason why is because the genealogy of Jesus includes women. And this is so rare. There are 5 women included in this genealogy. It's not normal for women to be included in a genealogy in the first century. In fact, in the first century, underneath the Roman Empire's leadership, women were not considered to have the equal rights as men. They didn't have the same dignity, the same worth. Women weren't allowed to dream certain dreams because they could not be in certain positions of leadership or employment. Women couldn't own land. They couldn't sell land. That was the circumstance that took place. Now, you may wonder what changed. And I would say, in my opinion, what changed was Jesus. That Jesus really does change everything for everyone, and the world has never been the same again because of the birth, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And women were restored with dignity and worth in new and fresh ways. In fact, it was women who were the first bearers of the gospel message of the resurrection of Jesus. And in this moment, Matthew's recording a genealogy that has a total of 5 women, and 4 of those women, you would assume that they would not be the same 4 that you would choose, maybe like Sarah or Rebecca, but that's not who is chosen. Instead, who is chosen are people like Rahab, who's known for being a prostitute, or Ruth, who is the product of a previous relational incest, or Bathsheba, who had an affair with David, or Tamar, whose story we will get to in a few moments. I mean, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, Tamar. What does this genealogy show us? What is it teaching us? I don't want you to miss this because this is so important. And may God minister to you even in considering this. This is all showing and revealing us that Jesus closely identifies with those who have sinned, and Jesus closely identifies with those who have been gravely sinned against. For instance, the story of Rahab. We typically refer to Rahab as a prostitute. She's someone who sold herself for the sexual pleasure of another. We might even use language like she is a homewrecker. And what gets rarely mentioned is that in the larger culture, it was a tolerated and even promoted sin. That men used her, men abused her, all in the name of pleasure. It was a system of sin. So make no mistake about it, Rahab was a sinner, but she was also gravely sinned against. Bathsheba is blamed for having an affair with David, leading David, if you will, into sin. And David is the king. How could she do such a thing? Well, that's not the entire picture. I'll draw your attention to a better picture. In 2 Samuel 11, the story is captured for us. In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. One evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. I can't prove this, but I think David was bored. And I think bored men make horrible, regrettable decisions. All I know is he remained at home when he should have been in the battle. We keep reading, and it says, from the roof he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, she's Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. And she went back home, and the woman conceived and sent word to David saying, I am pregnant. David is the one who initiates the affair. And we keep reading, David is the one who eventually sets the stage for Bathsheba's husband, Uriah, to be murdered. It is initiated by David. Did she commit any sin? Well, probably so. But she has been gravely sinned against. The entire genealogy of Jesus is revealing something profound about God. And certainly God does not overlook sin. God does not hide sin. God does not deny sin. But also, we should know that God comes to those who sin and those who have been sinned with unexpected grace. We looked at the first two women, and I want to direct your attention to Tamar. I thought about sharing her story from a 30,000-foot perspective, but then I realized most of us have never read or been in contact with her story. Most of us will probably never memorize Genesis chapter 38, and I thought that I would take just a few moments and read her story with us. It's worth sharing, and I'll warn you ahead of time, this is not something you will find in a children's Bible, but it is a story in the Bible, and it's important for us to slow down and consider. And so, would you just journey with me for a moment? It says, at the time Judah left his brothers and went down to stay with a man named Hirah. There Judah met the daughter of a Canaanite man named Shua. He married her and made love to her. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son who was named She conceived again and gave birth to another son who was named Onan. She gave birth still to another son who was named Shelah. And so there are 3 sons in this particular story. Judah got a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, sleep with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to raise up offspring for your brother. But Onan knew that the child would not be his. Whenever he slept with his brother's wife, he spilled his semen on the ground to keep from providing offspring for his brother. You may wonder, what in the world are we reading? We're reading the Bible. What he did was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death also. Judah then said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, live as a widow in your father's household until my son Shelah grows up. For he thought he may die too, just like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's household. After a long time, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. When Judah had recovered from his grief, he went up to Timnah, to the men who were shearing his sheep. And his friend, the Adamite, went to him. We keep reading. When Tamar was told, your father-in-law is on his way to Timnah to shear sheep, she took off her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, and then sat down at the entrance. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face, not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law. He went over to her by the roadside and said, come now, let me sleep with you. And what will you give me to sleep with you? She asked. I'll send you a young goat from my flock, he said. Will you give me something as a pledge until you send it? She asked. He said, what pledge should I give you? Your seal and its cord and the staff in your hand, she answered. So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. After she left, she took off her veil and put on her widow's clothes again. Meanwhile, Judah sent the young goat by his friend, the Adamite, in order to get his pledge back from the woman. But he did not find her. He asked the men who lived there, where is the shrine prostitute who was beside the road at Enam? There hasn't been any shrine prostitute here, they said. So he went back to Judah and asked, I didn't find her. Besides, the men who lived there said, there hasn't been any shrine or prostitute here. If you're still following, here's how the story ends. Then Judah said, let her keep what she has, or we will become a laughingstock. After all, I did send her this young goat, but you didn't find her. About 3 months later, Judah was told, your daughter-in-law, Tamar, is guilty of prostitution. And as a result, she is now pregnant. And Judah said, bring her out and have her burned to death. And as she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law. I am pregnant by the man who owns these, she said. And she added, see if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are. This is where Maury Povich says, he is the Father. I mean, what a story, right? What an incredible mess full of drama. What an incredible mess full of secrets. Did you notice how many secrets were unfolded there? And this is what I want you to consider this Advent season. We all have stories that we want to hide. We all have stories from our past in our family that we hope no one hears. Stories of an early pregnancy, or stories of a financial scandal, or stories of a betrayal. We have stories, we have secrets, and at the end of the day, some of those stories, to be honest with you, they have us. We need freedom this Christmas season. And what we tend to do whenever we're engaged and learn stories like that, we tend to hide, we tend to isolate, we tend to lie. And I just say to you, remember, we are only as sick as our secrets. And in our world, like in our families, whenever there's a scandal, a story that breaks out, if it's in a company, what does the company do? The company moves away quickly and completely, as if the employee never existed. They just kind of scrub the story away. That happens in the local church too. There's a scandal that breaks out, and the next thing you know, that person's name is just kind of removed from anything, anywhere. They're just scrubbed. It happens in our families too. All this points to is when sin happens, people tend to move away. We tend to distance ourselves. We tend to disassociate. And so we come back to the genealogy and we say, Matthew, what are you thinking? This is Jesus' royal genealogy, and you have Tamar, that story. You have Ruth, and you have Bathsheba, and you have Rahab. What are you doing? We disassociate from stories like that. We move away. But God doesn't move away from us because of sin. He moves towards us because of grace. Martin Luther said it best. Christ is the type of person that is not ashamed of sinners. In fact, He puts them in His family tree. Try for a moment imagining a conversation with Rahab, Bathsheba, or Tamar. If you were to ask them about their time within their family, the circumstances, they probably would have responded by saying something like, it was a complete failure. My story's full of shame and guilt. There's no redemption there. They probably looked at their story with great pain. They weren't proud of their story of their past. They weren't proud of the life and legacy that they had lived and the families that they had ruined. After all, how could redemption come from a story like that? Wasn't failure all over the place? No one around them in their lifetime probably could see any redemption from their story and from that moment. I mean, we read the story of Tamar, and to be honest with you, her sin and the sin all around that family was big. But I want to tell you this Christmas season, this Advent season, God's grace is bigger. When you read Tamar's story, she made some massive mistakes along the way. That family made some big mistakes. And I want to tell you this Christmas season that God's plan is even bigger than your mistakes. She had a son who had a son who had a son who had a son. And the line kept going until one day Tamar's great-great-great-great-grandson would be born in a manger in a small rural town in Bethlehem and grow up in Nazareth and die on a cross and resurrect in power. And this man would be the long-awaited Messiah, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, the Son of God. And Jesus would emerge from a family line of incredible shame. This is why when you read the genealogy, you're reading one of the most powerful illustrations this Christmas of the grace of God in the most unexpected places. Rahab's life was a mess. Bathsheba's life was full of lots of pain. Tamar's life was a mess. But out of their mess came the Messiah. The sin was big, but God's grace was bigger. So when you read the Christmas story, when you consider Advent, When you consider a God who knows how to provide grace in unexpected places to unexpected people, I want you to know that sin never has the last word. Grace does. Some of you, when it comes to your own story, when it comes to your own family tree, when it comes to your own life, your own past, you have looked at your past and you have thought that sin is great. I'm just here to tell you the grace of God is greater. Those mistakes are big. I'm here to tell you the redemptive power of God is bigger. The good news of Christmas is that God's grace is bigger than your sin. God's grace is bigger than your relationship mistakes. God's grace is bigger than your sexual mistakes. God's grace is bigger than your financial mistakes. God's grace is bigger than any sin you have committed. And would you like to hear even greater news? When it comes to your family, it's always a mixed bag. And to some degree, we are all the byproduct of a dysfunctional family with dysfunctional stories. We can have Jesus in our heart, but we still have grandpa in our bones. We have family patterns that we are not proud of, and we'd like to do things differently. But God's plan for you is better and bigger than your past family patterns. Your past can describe you, but it doesn't have to define you. I was sitting with someone just this past week, and we were talking. I asked them, "What is your story?" And for about 15 to 20 minutes, they shared their story and they led with their brokenness. They led with some of the decisions that they make that were not great decisions. And all throughout, it was a story of shame. And I asked them, "Are you a follower of Jesus?" And they said, "I am a follower of Jesus." I said, discipleship is about learning to live in a new family. And from this point forward, every time you share your story, you begin with, "Jesus has changed my life. I have encountered the grace of God and I'm never the same again." And sure, along the way, I've encountered some pain. Sure, along the way, I have a lot of mistakes. Sure, along the way, there are things that I would do differently. But God's grace is greater. God's grace is bigger. God's grace always shows up in unexpected places. So today, where do you need the grace of God to show up in an unexpected way? This Christmas, look for the unexpected grace of God to show up. When you're at the table with others, be a part of dispensing the unexpected grace of God. And yes, celebrate with family. Yes, enjoy presents. Yes, admire lights. But never forget that the good news of Christmas is that God's grace is bigger than your sin, that Jesus is born and the world has never been the same. Will you pray with me? Heavenly Father, I thank you for this moment, this space, this time. May your grace be unleashed. May we receive in new and fresh ways an encounter of your grace. Be people of your grace. Celebrate your grace. And we thank you for the greatest grace on display, the very birth of Jesus. We love you, Lord. In your name we pray. Amen.